Before the sun lifts the mist off the valley, the homestead is only breath and damp earth. A palm grazes the reed screen as if taking the house's pulse. We remember Shaka's spear because it rang on shields, but the room was tuned long before the first order by a woman who learned to count doors. Mkabayi kaJama, the twin who lived, made power a matter of distance and timing. 3 paces allowed, 1 greeting withheld, a guard changed an hour ahead of custom. She never wore a crown. She wore the clock. She repaired a failing inlet with a marriage, closed stray channels with a glance, and taught the screen which knocked to answer. In a court where a queen can import a second government, and a cradle can gather a faction by lullaby, she kept the map tight and the corridors clean. Her craft was simple and severe. Decide who may approach, who must wait, and which door must never open. To see how she did it, we need a map 3 lines, 1 ledger. Policy, culture, palace. Align them and a kingmaker doesn't need a crown. Mkabayi kaJama shaped outcomes by arranging conditions, not by seizing the stool. Policy is her first instrument. Marriages chosen like keystones. Calendars tightened until a wavering lineage could bear weight. Permission to found households held back or released, so the state, not private desire, set the rhythm of men's lives. Culture is her second. The slow language of aura taboos, cleansings, the respectful distance around a sovereign spoken so fluently, she could harden it when the realm needed awe, and soften it when counsel had to cross the reed screen. The palace is her third. Approach measured in footsteps and timing. The guard who takes midnight instead of dawn. The waiting mat placed 1 ring farther out. The quiet arithmetic by which a whisper becomes a decision. Our witnesses do not sing the same song. Some praise, some warn, some write from far beyond the dust they describe. So we will trust pattern over spectacle, testing every bright claim against the map of access and the timetable of events. Does this path make sense inside the rules that govern approach? Does this moment fit the calendar that governs obedience? The stakes are not scholarly, they are human and immediate. Read her correctly and you learn how a kingdom survives shock without splintering, and the price of that survival in decisions forged during narrow hours that do not ask to be loved, only obeyed. Theory means nothing without the first repair she made to the line. She began as a problem, then rewrote the family's future. She entered the story as a problem and chose to become its remedy. In a homestead where old talk weighed twins with dread, Mkabayi kaJama lived because her father, Jama Kandaba, refused the sacrifice the elders expected. She read that refusal as a charge. If her life had been spared against custom, then the line itself must be spared against chance. She studied the house the way a river reader studies current, where the flow narrows, where it hesitates, where a single reed can turn water. The inlet was failing. An aging father without a wife to carry the story forward. She did not argue with fate. She organized it. She found Methania of the Sibia and made the match that steadied the bank. From that decision came Senzangakona. We have done accordingly. A name that sounds like an answer to a question the house had been asking for years. When Jama died and the boy could not yet carry the weight, she stood in the gap as regent, not because tradition unrolled a mat for her, but because continuity needed a sentinel who would not blink. She learned the geometry of the reed screen, where to sit so counsel can pass without turning into gossip, which uncle belongs politely in the outer ring, which messenger must arrive before dawn, and which must learn to wait. She stayed unmarried by design, keeping her hands free of a second court and her ears free of brothers-in-law with long lists. Her loyalty ran forward, not sideways, to a future still hidden beyond the ridgeline. Power, to her, was not a trumpet. It was a set of habits repeated until a house forgets they were new. Then the rope tightened. In 1816, Senzangakona died. Sigujana rose and fell in the time it takes a noon shadow to cross the yard. The sources do not agree on every gesture in that narrow interval. They agree on the result. Shaka sat where decisions gather. For Mkabayi, the speed was the point. Succession is a race between blood and approach. And approach travels on feet. Before condolence could thicken into a network of favors, before a queen's gate could become someone else's office, she compressed the timetable and closed the day. She had seen too often how a cradle invites a faction, and how marriage imports another government through the doorway of kin. She would not let the palace drown in water it had not planned to carry. Severity to others was, to her, the only mercy that would last. A single clear course for a river that might otherwise braid itself to death in sand. She counted doors and the men who learned to stand by them, allowed some paths to widen and kept others so narrow no procession could form. The inlet was repaired, the banks held. What remained was to keep the current obedient, to turn calendars into weapons, to make timing do what spears could not. Fixing the inlet was only the start. She still had to steer the river. Now watch her turn calendars into weapons. Shaka taught regiments to move like one body. Mkabayi learned to make the palace breathe to that cadence. She did not contest the machine she nested inside it, treating the day like an instrument she could tune by half steps. A permission withheld in the morning would become a readiness by dusk. An audience brought forward by one sun length would catch a captain before his pride found allies. A gift delivered the night before council would turn a petition into a solution that arrived exactly on time. She watched guardless the way a careful bookkeeper watches a ledger, whose eyes own midnight, who greets first light, which pair of feet is allowed to scuff dust inside the inner ring. Change one watch and a message meets a different listener. Move one waiting mat a pace outward, and the same words grow lighter or heavier in the mouth. Nothing theatrical, everything cumulative, and by the season's end the horizon has shifted 2 degrees without anyone quite remembering when it began. The Abuto system gave her a hard frame to work within. Age mates drilled, fed, and praised together. Households delayed until the center released them. That delay did more than keep warriors ready. It kept the map of access tight. Fewer weddings meant fewer new keys. Fewer uncles learning the rhythm of the read screen. Fewer private corridors maturing into public leverage. Inside that narrowing, she worked like a seamstress, taking in the house until it sat close without splitting. If a captain pushed for an early marriage, his mat slid a ring outward and his request lost the warmth that makes a day bend. If a cohort needed release before loyalty soured, she argued for it when the room could carry the weight. The Isokoko headring, once a family milestone, became a seal from the state, and she saw to it that the pen did not wander. Her power was presence, not noise. She understood how a praise singer's stanza can tilt a day when a name falls one breath sooner than yesterday, and how a runner held at the threshold for an extra cup of water can make his message sound like timing instead of pressure. Because the machine answered to the calendar, she treated the calendar as a living thing. Let campaign season stay sovereign over wedding season. Keep the first meeting short and the second decisive. Leave no need for a third. Men left her hut believing the choice was theirs, and in a sense it was. She had only arranged the weather so that the sensible path lay dry underfoot, and the foolish one sucked at the ankles. In a state tuned to speed, her craft was to keep speed from becoming accident. The regiment still marched because captains spoke and the king's breath gathered the room to attention. What she did was ensure that when decisions arrived, they found the right doors open and the wrong ones politely stubborn. Mechanisms move bodies. Rituals move consent. In this house, taboo isn't a cage, it's a blade. Mkabayi understood that the slow grammar of ritual could move consent more cleanly than a shouted order, so she spoke it until it sounded like common sense. She kept the sovereign's distance sacred when awe was needed, then narrowed it with a timed approach when council had to cross the read screen. A cleansing postponed by a day cooled tempers without draining resolve. A libation poured at the right doorway turned courtesy into obligation. A slaughter set at dusk rather than dawn made remembrance feel like decision. She chose who witnessed which rite because witness is how a room later agrees on what happened. The king's body remained a shrine approach purchased by abstentions and prayers, but she knew when to spend a measure of that aura to buy clarity. Respect language trimmed of its heat, footfalls slowed at thresholds, eyes lowered at the mat. These were not decorations. They were the rails along which agreement could travel without jerking. Even praise could be tuned. A praise singer who placed a name one breath earlier than yesterday did more than polish honor. He nudged the day toward a verdict. She let the stanza fall that way when the house needed it, and held it back when it didn't. Rituals were her way of hiding the seam between necessity and consent, so that men left believing the river had always flowed that way. She also used taboo to carry the weight that naked policy could not bear. If a petition needed to wait, she let the calendar do the refusing. If a union threatened to import a second court, she found a purity to preserve, a silence to observe, a season not yet turned. In-law ambitions rarely announce themselves as power. They arrive as kinship and piety. She answered them in the same register, meeting borrowed authority with older rights, turning visits into vigils and audiences into observances, until the day's business belonged to the house again. Nothing theatrical, everything exact. A beer shared at the correct threshold bound a tongue without drawing blood. A diviner received at the right hour made the uncertain feel patient. When the head ring became a state gift, She wrapped its bestowal in formality so that the signature came from the center and looked like custom rather than control. She did not counterfeit belief, she arranged it. The sacred remained sacred. She merely chose when it would open a door and when it would keep one shut. Ritual, in her hands, was also a shield for the ruler and a mirror for the ruled. The king observed the same distances that he asked of his warriors. The house saw that the law cut both ways and accepted its edge. Where others spent aura carelessly, she budgeted it like cattle in a dry season, letting scarcity raise the value of each appearance, each word, each nod that shortened the space between a petitioner and a reply. She understood that fear can move bodies, but only reverence keeps them in formation when the dust is thick and the news is bad. So she tuned reverence into rhythm. First fruits before celebration, cleansing before counsel, silence before a hard truth. By the time the decision arrived, it felt like a festival ending on time rather than a command beginning too soon. In this way, culture became ammunition that left no smoke. None of this was softness. It was precision how to keep the center undivided without turning it to stone. She measured out sanctity and access so the state could breathe. The sovereign remained more symbol than man when danger prowled, then became more man than symbol when the room needed to hear a voice and not an echo. She made the sacred serve the living without insulting the dead. And when the house refused to move to a gentle hand, she knew what followed. Ritual can soften power. Sometimes it must harden it. Then comes the page history argues about. After morning thinned and the air inside the homestead took on that brittle quiet, Kwadukuza held its breath. The house had been trained to move at a single signal, and now the signal faltered. Somewhere between dusk and the first coolness off the cattle pens, a narrow passage gathered intent. 3 men who knew the floor by heart, Dingane, Mlangana, Mbafa, walked like servants on a familiar errand and arrived as deciders. The reed screen that had opened for counsel and returned from campaign opened once more. Steel made the small sound steel makes in a hut where words have run out. Some swear a nod had been given days before. Others swear no such permission existed. The corridor does not testify. It only shortens the distance between resolve and act. When the dust settled, Shaka no longer breathed in the house he had tuned. What followed moved outward along the channels, a kingdom already trusted. Threshold keepers lifted a hand for calm because turmoil is expensive and mourning must be paid for. Captains set their ibutho to stand, not to charge. Posture is the first language of legitimacy. A praise singer shifted a stanza by a breath and made new order sound remembered. The guard lists, rewritten by inches, put familiar faces where disputes might have started, and messengers ran the old paths with new names on their tongues. If there was a design behind the night, it hid inside the grammar of a palace that thinks indoors. Decisions travel fastest where feet already know the way. And Mkabayi? The house remembers her inside the doorway at first light, not as a mourner, not as a herald, but as a weight that kept the room from tipping. Some accounts place her shadow behind the permission to act. Others keep her hands out of the night and fix them firmly on the morning after. Either way, the pattern holds. In a vacuum, she chose order over theater. The regiments faced the center. The insignia changed hands without ripping cloth. Petitions were heard in the same sequence as yesterday, so the day would not announce a rupture it did not need to. She did not invent a story in the chaos. She preserved the routine that allowed a story to be told at all. That is the hard page of the ledger. The one that asks whether mercy can sometimes look like a closed door, and whether a closed door can sometimes be the only bridge left. There is no gentle way to balance that page. A king who narrowed access kept his realm quick and obedient. The very narrowness made a corridor strong enough to decide a reign. The price is paid in the way memory speaks of those who kept the room steady. Some will call them the spine that saved the body, others the hand that guided the blade. She lived long enough to carry both names, and the line she guarded lived with her. Set aside verdicts for a moment, count the methods. 6 rules, each paid for in dust. The first is repair. When the inlet fails, you do not plead with the river, you change its mouth. Mkabayi did this once with a marriage that steadied the bank, and the move became a habit of mind step in before drift becomes custom, align kinship so the line can hold. The second is speed. Succession is a race between blood and approach travels on feet. Compress the timetable so condolence cannot harden into a network, so a queen's brothers do not learn the rhythm of the inner gate before the day is decided. Let the new center form while rivals are still tying their sandals. The third is anchorage. Titles are weather, but a crawl is ground. Keep a house that owes you before it owes anyone else, people who know your fire, who will carry a message without asking which wind is fashionable this week. With anchorage comes the fourth rule, the grammar of access. The palace is a sentence you can edit by changing the doorkeeper. Midnight given to one set of eyes, dawn to another, a waiting mat nudged a ring outward, a gift placed the night before council. These are not courtesies. They are instruments that lower or raise the pitch of a request until it lands a solution, instead of noise. The fifth rule is to make ritual carry what naked policy cannot. Rites are the slow language that turns consent into something people feel rather than fear. Pour the beer at the right threshold, and a tongue binds itself without being told. Time the cleansing so anger cools but resolve does not thin. Let the praise singer place a name a breath earlier, and the room will lean without knowing why. Sacred distance keeps the sovereign from being spent like small coin. Spent in measure, it buys clarity at the very moment. Decisions must be heard as natural, not forced. The last rule is aftermath. If a corridor has decided the night, the morning must be order oaths taken without theater, insignia exchanged without ripping cloth, regiments set to stand so the realm feels continuity in its bones, even as the names on the wind change. None of this needs a crown. It needs a memory for doors, a calendar that answers to the state rather than to appetite, and the nerve to make timing do what spears cannot. A playbook this sharp leaves a receipt. Mercy measured in doors has a price. A state that moves at a single signal feels clean to the hand that gives it, but the hand is mortal, and the cleanliness writes a debt. Mkabayi's playbook kept the house tight. Marriages delayed so the regiments could answer at a shout. The Isakoko bestowed from the center so allegiance ran through one gate. Rituals timed so consent flowed along rails she could inspect. It worked. The country learned to breathe with one chest, to carry decisions without dropping them, to keep the map of approach short enough that a message could cross it before suspicion did. Yet, each spared corridor, each unopened door, also removed a cushion the future would one day need. A queen's brothers never arrived to absorb the restless energies that gather at thresholds. A cradle never collected loyalties early and taught ambition to wait its turn. The very speed that spared the realm from a dozen small quarrels made it possible for one corridor, correctly timed, to choose a morning for everyone. She knew this, and still she kept the house narrow, because the alternative was to invite a second government and let access become a marketplace. There is dignity in such austerity. The law that braided a people bound their sovereign, and the woman who guarded the law bound herself to its edge. But there is danger too. A palace that has learned to think in doors will always find a door when the center falls silent. If the crown will not pass through a cradle, it will pass through a hinge, and the men who know hinges will decide how softly it swings. That is the receipt pinned to her ledger. On one side, present tense strength mobilization that ignores harvest, obedience that survives bad news, a calendar that answers to the realm rather than appetite. On the other, a future that must be seized rather than inherited. Legitimacy assembled in the morning instead of slept into overnight. Had she widened the map admitted a queen's court, let alliances braid themselves in daylight, the state would have moved slower but bled less at succession. She chose speed and clarity, and the country lived. She chose tightness, and the night at Kwadukuza became possible. The lesson is not that she was wrong, nor that softness would have saved more lives. It is that order fashioned from thresholds must one day be paid for at a threshold. Your turn to weigh the ledger. Strategy, trauma, or taboo. What carried the most weight? You have walked the corridors with us. Now place your hand on the ledger. If you believe the sealed door to a prince was deliberate architecture, write a strategy and say why. If you hear a private weather hardened into law, write B trauma and name the moment that convinced you. If you read sacred distance as the true governor of intimacy and policy, write C taboo and point to the right that made it plain. Leave a single, clear line with your letter and your reason. The strongest readings will shape where we go next. And because a throne taken in a corridor must learn to breathe in daylight, our next story opens with Dingane's ledger the morning after, when order has to sound familiar to be obeyed. For those who want the paper trail, here's the scaffold we stood on.